more than 40,000 people. That is how many Americans were driven from their homes in the last 48 hours by a fire that started when a tractor bumped a rock. Stop and feel how wrong that sentence is. A catastrophe is supposed to have a catastrophic cause. An earthquake, an explosion, a storm of historic violence. Instead, the cause here is almost nothing. A flicker of friction, a spark you could have cupped in your hand and watched die. So the question this video is built around is not a question about a tractor at all. It is a question about a country. What has happened to the American landscape that a spark that small can now do damage that large? We're going to answer that. And the answer is not a mystery, and it is not local, and it should not be ignored. Before we begin, like this video and subscribe to the Sky Lab, where we follow the story past the headline. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and let's break this down. Part 1. The Spark That Shouldn't Have Mattered. At 17 minutes past 10 in the morning on Monday, May 18th, 2026, a piece of steel touched a rock. That is the whole beginning. That, and nothing more dramatic, is where this story starts. There is no lightning strike in this story, no downed power line throwing arcs into the dark, no act of malice, no dramatic origin at all. A person was operating a tractor in the hills south of Simi Valley, California, on agricultural land, doing the kind of ordinary work that happens on 10,000 properties across this country every single day. The blade, or the bucket, or some hard part of the machine struck a rock buried in the dry ground. Steel met stone. For a fraction of a second, the friction threw off a spark, a single, tiny, almost weightless point of heat, the kind of spark you could cup in your hand and watch die. It did not die. It should have. On almost any other day, in almost any other year, it would have. It landed in dry brush. And within hours, that spark had become something with a name. They called it the Sandy Fire. By the next morning, it had eaten more than 2 square miles of hillside. Within roughly 48 hours, it had burned close to 1,700 acres, destroyed at least one home, and forced tens of thousands of people, first 17,000, then far more, out of their houses and onto the roads, watching the sky behind them turn the colour of an old bruise. I want you to sit with the strangeness of that for a moment, because the strangeness is the entire point of what we're going to talk about today. A tractor hit a rock, and more than 40,000 Americans lost the right to sleep in their own beds. Stop and think about how those two facts do not fit together. We have a mental model of how disasters work, and that model says that big effects come from big causes. A catastrophe should have a catastrophic origin. When a city has to evacuate, our instinct tells us that something powerful must have happened. An earthquake, an explosion, a storm of historic violence. We expect the size of the cause to roughly match the size of the consequence. That is how the world is supposed to behave. We carry that expectation with us everywhere. It is one of the quiet rules by which we navigate the world, and most of the time it serves us well. A loud effect, we assume, means a loud cause. A house does not collapse without a reason proportional to a collapsing house. A river does not flood a town without rain to match. And here, that rule has simply broken. Here, the cause is almost comically small. A spark from farm equipment is one of the lowest energy ignition events it is possible to have. It is so minor that for most of human history in most places, on most days, it would have meant nothing at all. The spark would have hit the ground, scorched a patch of dirt the size of a coin, and gone out before anyone noticed. The tractor operator would have kept working. There would be no fire, no name, no evacuation, no story. The person on that tractor has almost certainly struck rocks before. Anyone who has worked land with machinery has thrown sparks off stone and watched nothing happen 100 times, 1,000 times, and thought nothing of it, because nothing was the correct and expected outcome. Nothing is what is supposed to happen. So the question that opens this video is not a question about a tractor. It is a question about a country. What has happened to the American landscape, to the actual ground beneath our feet, the grass and the brush and the soil, that a spark that small can now do damage that large? Because that is the real event here. The Sandy Fire is not, by the brutal arithmetic of recent California fire history, a large fire. Under 2,000 acres is, by the standards of the fires this state has lived through, almost modest. California has, in living memory, lost individual fires that burned hundreds of thousands of acres that erased whole towns, that killed dozens of people in a single afternoon. Against that scale, a 1,700-acre fire that took one home and, as of the latest reporting, no lives, is not the kind of event that the rest of the country would normally even register. If this video were only about the Sandy Fire as a fire, it would not need to exist. There are bigger fires. There will be bigger fires this year. What makes the Sandy Fire worth your time is not its size. It is what its size, combined with the smallness of its cause, tells us. It is a signal. It is a message written in smoke over a suburb of Los Angeles, and the message is meant for the entire country, not just for Ventura County. The message is that something fundamental has changed about how easily this land burns, and that the thing standing between an ordinary careless moment and a full-scale disaster has gotten very, very thin. Let me put one more frame around this before we go any further, because the proportions of this story are the thing I most want you to feel. Think about the relationship between the energy of the cause and the energy of the result. A spark thrown by steel grazing stone is a flicker. A few sparks, visible for a fraction of a second, carrying a vanishingly small amount of heat. Now weigh that against the result. A fire that consumed close to 1,700 acres, that put more than 40,000 people on the road, that demanded the round-the-clock labour of nearly 900 firefighters and a fleet of aircraft and bulldozers. The energy released by that fire, the destruction it caused, the human effort it consumed, all of it is larger than the energy of the spark that started it by a factor so enormous that the word factor almost stops being useful. The cause and the effect are not in the same universe of scale, and that mismatch is not a quirk of this particular fire. It is the defining feature of fire in a drought, and it is the thing that should genuinely unsettle you, because it means the usual relationship between how careful you are and how safe you are has been broken. In a normal year, a small mistake produces a small consequence, and a large catastrophe requires a large failure. In a drought year, a small mistake, or no mistake at all, just an ordinary moment, can produce a catastrophe. The proportionality is gone, and a world without proportionality between cause and effect is a world that is much harder to live in safely, because your caution no longer scales with your risk. The hills where this started sit about 30 miles northwest of downtown Los Angeles. Simi Valley is not a remote place. It's a city of more than 125,000 people, a settled suburban community with schools and neighborhoods and shopping centers, the kind of place where the wild edge and the residential edge press right up against each other. Fire scientists actually have a name for that boundary. They call it the wildland-urban interface, the zone where human development and undeveloped, flammable land meet and interlace. It is the most dangerous real estate in modern fire terms, because it is where an ignition in the brush has houses within its reach, and where the things people do, the driving, the building, the working, the living, provide a constant supply of potential sparks right at the edge of the fuel. Simi Valley is the wildland-urban interface. So much of the developed American West is. The fire burned close to several of the city's schools. It burned close to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library, a national landmark which is part of why the rest of the country looked up from whatever it was doing and noticed at all. But notice what the coverage tended to lead with. It led with the tractor, it led with the rock. It treated the ignition as the story, as if the explanation for 40,000 evacuations is a tractor hit a rock, full stop, mystery solved. And that framing, I want to argue, is not just incomplete. It is actively misleading. It points your attention at exactly the wrong thing. It invites you to think that if only that one tractor had not struck that one rock, the disaster would not have happened. That the whole event hinges on a single avoidable moment of bad luck. And that is a comforting thought because it makes the catastrophe feel like a fluke. It was not a fluke. Because the tractor is not the cause of this disaster. The tractor is the trigger. And a trigger and a cause are not the same thing. Think of it this way. If a building is filled, floor to ceiling, with explosive vapor, and someone walks in and flicks a light switch, what caused the explosion? You can say the light switch caused it. The spark from the switch contacts was, technically, the ignition. But you understand intuitively that this is a strange and unsatisfying answer. The light switch did almost nothing. It released energy that was already there, already waiting, already loaded into the room by something else entirely. The real cause of that explosion is whatever filled the building with vapor. The switch is just the last small thing that happened. If you cleared that room of vapour and aired it out, you could flick that same switch 1,000 times and get nothing but light. The switch is not dangerous. The room is dangerous. The switch only reveals it. The sandy fire is the light switch, and the question this whole video is built around is the only question that actually matters. Who filled the building with vapour? What loaded the hills of Ventura County so completely that a spark from a tractor could set off a chain reaction big enough to move a city? We are going to answer that question. We are going to follow it down through the dry grass and into the soil and back through the driest months this country has recorded in well over a century. And we are going to find that the answer is not local, and it is not strange, and it is not a mystery in the way mysteries usually are. The answer is sitting in plain sight, documented by every weather agency in the nation, and it stretches across more than 40% of the United States. There is one more thing I want to flag before we move on, because it matters for how you should hold this whole story. When a disaster has a small identifiable trigger, a tractor, a rock, there is a strong temptation to make the story about that trigger and stop there. It is a satisfying place to stop, because it gives you a clean, contained narrative with a beginning and an end. A man, a machine, a spark, a fire. But that tidy little narrative quietly does something dangerous. It lets the rest of us off the hook. It makes the disaster feel like it belongs to that one person, and that one unlucky moment, something that happened over there, to someone else, because of a specific avoidable error. And if the disaster is really about a drought-loaded landscape that spans nearly half the country, then it does not belong to that one person at all. It belongs to all of us, and it is not over there. It is potentially wherever the land is dry. So every time the coverage says, "A tractor started the Sandy fire," I want you to mentally add the rest of the sentence. And a year-long record-breaking drought is what made a started fire into a disaster. The first half is a fact about one morning. The second half is a fact about the country. But before we get to the why, I want to stay with the fire itself a little longer, because the timeline of how the Sandy fire grew is, all by itself, the first piece of evidence, and it is evidence that something has gone badly wrong with the ground. The fire wrote a record of its own behaviour across 48 hours, hour by hour, and if you read that record carefully, it's already telling you that the spark was never the point. Let us read it. Part 2, 48 hours. Let us walk through what actually happened, hour by hour, because the speed of it is the thing you need to feel. The spark lands at around 10:17 in the morning, mid-morning, May, Southern California. The fire is reported almost immediately. This is not a blaze that smoulders unseen for a day in some roadless wilderness. It starts in the hills above a major suburb, in clear daylight, and it is seen and called in fast. Crews respond fast. By every measure of the human side of this, the response was quick and competent. I want to be clear about that from the start and stay clear about it, because the speed of the response is going to matter for the argument. The people whose job was to catch this fire were not slow, and they were not asleep. They were on it. And it still got away from them in those first hours. Hold on to that, because it tells you what they were up against. By that point, the fire already had what it needed, and what it needed was not time. It was fuel and it was wind. The wind that first day was gusting to more than 30 miles an hour. 30 miles an hour does not sound apocalyptic. It is not a hurricane. It is a breezy afternoon. You have stood in a 30-mile-an-hour wind and been mildly annoyed by it and thought nothing more of it. It is the kind of wind that flips an umbrella inside out, that makes you squint, that you forget about an hour after you go inside. But put that same ordinary breezy afternoon behind a fire that has found receptive fuel, and 30 miles an hour becomes an engine. The wind does 3 things at once, and each one is dangerous on its own. First, it pushes the flame front forward, physically bending the fire in the direction it wants to spread, lengthening and tilting the flames so they lean out over fresh, unburned ground. Second, it feeds the fire oxygen, and remember the fire triangle, which we're about to build properly. Oxygen is one of the 3 legs, and a wind is, in effect, a bellows, pumping the combustion harder and hotter. Third, and most dangerous of all, it throws embers. A wind-driven fire lofts burning fragments, bits of flaming bark, twig, leaf, up into the moving air, and that air carries them ahead of the main fire, sometimes well ahead, and drops them into fuel the fire has not reached yet. Each one of those embers is a new ignition attempt. Fire scientists call this spotting, and it is the single most frustrating, most dangerous behaviour a fire can show, because it means the fire is no longer a line you can draw a boundary around. A spotting fire reaches, it jumps, it starts copies of itself downwind, beyond your containment line, behind your crews. A wind-driven fire does not crawl outward in a neat expanding circle, the way a campfire's scorch mark would. It leaps ahead of itself. So through that first afternoon and into the evening, the sandy fire ran. It consumed, by the next morning's accounting, more than 2 square miles of dry brush. Picture that. 2 square miles is a meaningful chunk of a city. It is hundreds of football fields laid edge to edge. It is a space you could not walk across in under an hour. The fire covered that ground in less than a day, on a 30-mile-an-hour breeze in the month of May. Not in a Santa Ana wind event, not in the teeth of the fire season, on an ordinary spring afternoon with an ordinary spring wind. Then came a small mercy. Overnight, the winds calmed, and here we get to see the other side of the equation. What happens when one of the fire's engines is taken away? With the wind down, firefighters were able to make real progress. A department spokesperson put it about as plainly as it can be put. They had made a lot of progress against the fire with the improved weather conditions, and the crews hoped to make further progress before the winds increased again. Read that sentence again, because it is quietly devastating. Before the winds increased again. The people fighting this fire were not thinking in terms of "we have beaten this." They were thinking in terms of a window, a temporary, weather-granted window, and racing to do as much as they could inside it before the window closed. Containment, which had been sitting at just 5%, began to climb. By the update on May 20th, it had reached around 15%. And it is worth pausing on what containment actually means, because the word gets used loosely. Containment is not the same as the fire being out. A fire that is 15% contained is not 15% extinguished. Containment refers to the perimeter, the edge of the fire, and specifically to how much of that edge has a control line around it that crews are confident the fire will not cross. 15% containment means that around 15% of the fire's edge has been secured, and 85% of it has not. The fire is still very much alive inside that perimeter. Containment climbing from 5 to 15 is real, genuine progress, and the crews earned every point of it. But it is also a reminder of how much fight was still ahead even as the news was improving. I want to be fair and clear about this, because it matters, and because this channel does not deal in panic for its own sake. The people fighting this fire are doing their jobs well. Roughly 869 personnel were assigned to the Sandy Fire, pulled in from agencies all across Southern California through mutual aid agreements. The system by which fire departments lend each other crews and equipment when one of them faces something too big to handle alone. Mutual aid is one of the quiet triumphs of how this country fights fire. It means a single county is never truly alone against a major incident, because the resources of an entire region can converge on it. They had hand crews on the ground, cutting line with tools by hand on terrain too steep for anything else. They had bulldozers carving wider breaks. They had helicopters and air tankers making drops of water and retardant from above. They worked around the clock, in shifts, through the night. And the overnight progress is real. This is not a story about failure. The firefighters are not the problem in this story. If anything, they are the reason this story has the relatively merciful shape it does. But notice what it took. It took the wind dying down. The single biggest factor in the crews finally getting a grip on this fire was not something they did. It was the weather doing them a favour. The skill and the effort were necessary, but they were not, by themselves, sufficient. They needed the wind to relent, and when it did, they could convert their effort into containment. And the moment the weather stopped cooperating, even briefly, the danger came right back. At one point, unpredictable, shifting winds kicked up a spot fire. A new ignition outside the main perimeter started by exactly the kind of wind-carried ember we described, and that single spot fire forced officials to send in more than 100 additional firefighters. Let that sink in. One gust, one ember, 100 more people committed to the fight. That is the exchange rate when the fuel is this receptive. A single ember can cost you 100 firefighters' worth of response. That is the texture of fighting fire in these conditions. You're not really managing a problem so much as you're negotiating with the wind, and you do not get to set the terms. You get to work hard, work fast, and hope the weather gives you a window, and you know that the window can close without warning. And I want to make sure one implication of that is not lost, because it bears directly on the central argument of this whole video. We tend to think of firefighting capacity as the thing that determines whether a fire becomes a disaster. More crews, more aircraft, more equipment, better technology, and surely you can stop more fires. And capacity does matter. Nobody is arguing it does not. But look at what actually decided the Sandy Fire's trajectory. The crews were fast, numerous, well-equipped and skilled, and through that first afternoon with the wind up and the fuel receptive, all of that was not enough to stop the fire from running. What turned the corner was not a surge of additional capacity. It was the wind dropping overnight. The decisive variable was a condition, not a resource. And that should tell you something sobering about the limits of the fix-it-with firefighters' instinct. When the fuel bed is loaded badly enough and the wind is up, there is a point past which, throwing more people at the fire stops scaling. The fire is simply moving faster than any line can be cut. The crews become, in effect, hostages to the weather and the fuel, able to win only when the conditions allow them to win. That is not a criticism of firefighting. It is a recognition that firefighting operates downstream of the fuel state. The drought sets the difficulty of the fight before the first engine ever arrives. You cannot staff your way out of a landscape that has been turned into kindling. The only thing that genuinely diffuses the situation is the thing no fire department controls, moisture coming back into the fuel. The terrain made all of it harder. The hills south of Simi Valley are steep and difficult, and steep terrain is not a neutral backdrop to a fire. It is an accelerant in its own right. Fire moves uphill faster than it moves on a flat ground, and it does so for a reason rooted in simple physics. Flames lean. Heat rises. When a fire is burning on a slope, its flames tilt in toward the hillside above them, and that tilting means the flame is physically closer to the unburned fuel upslope. It is preheating that fuel, drying it, warming it, driving the moisture out of it, before the fire even arrives. By the time the flame front reaches that upslope brush, the brush is already primed, already half prepared to ignite, already hot and dry from the radiant heat that rolled up the hill ahead of the flames. The steeper the slope, the stronger this effect, and on a steep enough hillside a fire can accelerate dramatically, almost explosively as it climbs. So a fire in steep hills does not just spread, it runs uphill, preheating its own path, accelerating into ground it has already prepared for itself. And the steepness does something else too. It fights the firefighters directly. Steep, broken terrain is hard and dangerous to get crews and engines into. It limits where you can cut a containment line by hand or by bulldozer. A dozer cannot safely work a slope past a certain angle, and a hand crew cutting line on a steep face is doing brutal, slow, hazardous work. It forces you to rely more heavily on aircraft, on water and retardant drops from above, because the ground simply will not let enough people get close enough fast enough. Every advantage the terrain gives the fire, it takes away from the people trying to stop it. The hill helps the fire and hinders the crew. That is the geometry the Sandy Fire was fought on. Now hold the whole timeline in your mind at once. A spark at 10:17 on a Monday morning, 2 square miles gone by Tuesday. A fast, competent, well-resourced response that still could not get ahead of it until the wind chose to relent. An evacuation order that started at 17,000 people and did not stop there. Because that number, the evacuation count, has its own story, and it is one of the most revealing details in this entire event. The figure that went around the country, the one in the national headlines, was more than 17,000 people under evacuation orders. That number was accurate when it was first reported, and then it became wrong because the fire kept moving and the danger kept widening. As the Sandy Fire developed through the 19th and into the 20th, the evacuation footprint expanded and expanded again. The current official figure is in the neighbourhood of 43,700 residents under mandatory evacuation orders, with several hundred more under evacuation warnings. The lower level alert that means get ready. This could be you next. Have a bag packed and a plan ready. Think about what that escalation means. The number of people forced from their homes by this fire roughly tripled, from 17,000 to over 40,000, in about a day. The human cost of the fire grew faster than the news could keep up with. The headline went stale while you were reading it. A reporter wrote 17,000, and it was true. And by the time the story had been read and shared and discussed, It was no longer true because the thing it described had moved. And I want you to think just for a moment about what is actually inside that number, because it is easy to let a figure like 43,700 go by as an abstraction. It is not an abstraction. It is 43,700 individual decisions to leave. It is that many people who, on a Monday or a Tuesday in May, looked up, saw the smoke, checked their phones, and were told, go. It is the particular awful arithmetic of evacuation, the few minutes in which you decide what, out of an entire life's worth of belongings, will fit in a car. The documents, the medications, the pets, the photographs, if there is time, and often there is not. It is elderly people who cannot move quickly, and families with small children, and people without a car of their own, and people who have nowhere obvious to go. An evacuation order is not a statistic. It is 43,700 small emergencies happening at once, and every single one of them traces back through the chain we are building to a spark off a rock, and behind the spark to the drought. That is the human weight the fuel state argument is carrying. It is worth keeping it in view. We will come back to that number in another sense later, because there is a theory circulating online that the 17,000 figure was a deliberate lie, an undercount, a cover-up. It was not. But the fact that the claim found an audience tells us something about how unsettled people are, and we owe that unease an honest answer rather than a dismissal. Hold that thread. We will pull it. For now, the timeline has done its job. It has shown us a fire that started from nothing, from the smallest ignition source you can reasonably imagine, and grew at a speed that should not be possible from a cause that small, against a response that was fast and competent and well-equipped. And that brings us back, with more force this time, to the only question worth asking. The firefighters were fast. The fire was faster. Why? What was waiting in those hills that turned a tractor's spark into a 40,000-person emergency in 48 hours? To answer that, we have to stop looking at the fire and start looking at the fuel. We have to look at the ground itself. Part 3. The Fire Triangle and the Leg That Broke. There is a very old, very simple idea that firefighters and fire scientists use to think about why anything burns. It is called the fire triangle, and understanding it is the key that unlocks this entire story, so I want to walk through it slowly, because once you have it, you will never look at a wildfire headline the same way again. A fire, any fire, from a candle to the sandy fire, needs 3 things, and it needs all 3 at the same time. Take away any one of them and the fire cannot exist. The 3 things are heat, oxygen and fuel. That is the triangle. 3 sides, 3 requirements. Remove a single side and the triangle collapses, the fire goes out or never starts at all. This is not a metaphor. It is the actual operating principle that the entire science of firefighting is built on. When firefighters smother a fire, they are removing the oxygen leg. When they cool it with water, they are removing the heat leg. When they cut a fire break, scraping a strip of ground down to bare earth, they are removing the fuel leg. They are creating a gap the fire cannot cross because there is nothing there to burn. Heat is the ignition, the initial input of energy that gets combustion started. A match, a spark, a lightning strike, a hot ember, the focused friction of steel dragged across stone. Oxygen is in the air all around us, so in an open-air wildfire, oxygen is almost never the limiting factor. The atmosphere supplies it freely and endlessly, and wind, as we saw, can supply it even faster, and fuel is the material that actually burns. In a wildfire, the fuel is the vegetation, the grass, the brush, the shrubs, the chaparral, the trees, the dead leaves and fallen branches on the ground. Now here is the part that matters, the part that most coverage of wildfires never explains, and the part that turns this from a news story into an actual understanding of what is happening to this country. In a normal, healthy, well-watered landscape, the limiting leg of that triangle, the side that is hardest to satisfy, the side that is doing the protective work, is the fuel. And that sounds strange at first, even backwards, because the brush is right there, visible, abundant, covering every hillside. How can fuel be the hard part when the hills are blanketed in it? The answer is that not all fuel is ready to burn. Living vegetation is full of water. A green plant, a healthy shrub, a living blade of grass. These things are, by weight, substantially water. They are, in a real sense, mostly water held in a structure of fibre, and water is the enemy of fire. Before a flame can ignite a living plant, it first has to do the work of boiling off all the moisture inside that plant. It has to spend its heat energy drying the fuel before it can spend any heat energy actually burning the fuel. That is a real, physical tax. It is a cost the fire has to pay up front before it gets anything in return. Think of trying to light a campfire with green, freshly cut wood. Wood still full of sap. It resists. It hisses and steams and smokes and refuses to catch, because the flame you're holding to it is spending all its energy fighting the water, and there is nothing left over to sustain combustion. Now think of well-seasoned, properly dried firewood. It catches almost eagerly. Same wood. The only difference is the water. So in a well-watered landscape, the fuel is wet, and wet fuel resists. A spark lands on a green, moisture-rich hillside, and the spark simply does not have enough energy to pay the drying tax. It scorches a leaf, it boils a little water, and it dies. The fuel leg of the triangle is not satisfied, because the fuel is not actually ready to be fuel. It is just wet vegetation. And so, in a normal year, the landscape itself is a kind of safety system. It is fireproofed by its own water. The ignition source can be quite substantial. It can be a real spark, a real ember, a genuinely hot piece of metal, and still fail because the fuel will not cooperate. The green hillside absorbs the ignition and gives nothing back. That is the system working. That is the margin of safety, and most of us have lived our whole lives inside it without ever knowing it was there, because a working safety system is invisible. Fire scientists even have a number for this. They talk about something called fuel moisture, and specifically live fuel moisture, which is roughly a measure of how much water is in living plants compared to their dry weight. It is tracked, sampled, and forecast, because it is one of the most important things you can know about a landscape if your job is to predict fire. When that number is high, the vegetation is green and juicy and hard to light. When that number is low, the vegetation has been drained, and a plant with low fuel moisture does not behave like a plant anymore as far as a fire is concerned. It behaves like kindling, like cured firewood, like something that was deliberately placed there to burn. There is a threshold, a point where live fuel moisture drops low enough that fire behavior changes in kind, not just in degree, where vegetation that was a barrier becomes vegetation that is an accelerant. And there is a related idea worth knowing: dead fuel. When grass cures completely, when it dies and dries, it becomes what scientists call a fine dead fuel, and fine dead fuels are the most ignitable material in any landscape. They are thin, they have an enormous surface area for their volume, they hold almost no water, and they respond to the dryness of the air within hours. Cured grass is, functionally, a carpet of kindling laid across the ground, and this is the hinge of the entire video. This is the sentence I need you to take away from the next 90 minutes. A severe, prolonged drought does one specific, catastrophic thing to the fire triangle. It removes the fuel limitation. When a drought drives the moisture out of the vegetation, when live fuel moisture falls far enough, and when dead, dried out fine fuels like cured grass pile up across the ground, the landscape stops resisting. The safety system switches off. The fuel leg of the triangle, which used to be the hard part, the protective part, the side doing all the quiet defensive work, becomes trivially easy to satisfy. The hills are no longer covered in wet, fire-resistant vegetation. They are covered in fuel that is genuinely completely ready, pre-loaded, waiting. The green barrier has become a brown accelerant, and it happened slowly over months, without anyone watching a single dramatic moment, because drought is the slowest disaster there is. Nobody can point to the day the hillside became dangerous. It just gradually, quietly did. And once the fuel is in that state, look what happens to the role of the ignition source. Suddenly the heat leg of the triangle no longer has to be powerful. It no longer has to pay a drying tax because the drought already paid it. The moisture is already gone. So now the ignition source just has to be enough to start the reaction, and enough has collapsed to almost nothing. The threshold has fallen through the floor. A spark from steel hitting a rock carries enough energy. A signal flare carries enough energy. A spark from a power tool, the heat radiating off a vehicle's exhaust system when it is parked over tall dry grass. A dragging chain on a trailer throwing sparks along the shoulder of a highway. A carelessly discarded cigarette. A backyard barbecue ember riding the breeze, a piece of equipment running hot. In a drought-loaded landscape, every single one of those carries enough energy. None of them would have been enough in a wet year. The green hillside would have absorbed every one of them. All of them are enough now. The list of things that can start a catastrophe has expanded to include essentially every warm or sparking object in ordinary human life. This is why I keep insisting that the tractor is not the cause of the Sandy fire. The drought is the cause of the Sandy fire. The drought is what walked into the building and filled it with vapor. The tractor just flicked the switch. And in a drought year, there are 1,000 switches, and they are all live and they are all around us all the time. Let me put this as plainly as I possibly can, because it reframes how you should think about fire risk for the rest of this video, and, frankly, for the rest of this year. The intuitive model of fire says, fires are caused by their ignition sources. Find the spark, find the culprit, and you have found the cause. It is a satisfying model because it gives you someone or something to blame, and a single, fixable point of failure. The accurate model of fire in a drought year says something much more unsettling. The ignition source is interchangeable, and the fuel state is the real cause. If it had not been a tractor on May 18th, it would have been something else on May 19th, or May 20th, or any day the conditions held. The drought did not arrange for a specific spark. The drought arranged for it so that any spark would do. It did not load one gun. It made the whole landscape combustible, and then waited, with infinite patience, for the statistically inevitable. And I want to push this one step further, into the question of speed, because the drought does not only make fires start more easily, it makes them spread faster once they have started, and it does so by attacking nearly every variable that governs a fire's rate of spread, all at once, simultaneously. How fast a fire moves across the land depends on a handful of things working together. It depends on fuel moisture, and we have just seen the drought drives that down, which means each individual plant ignites faster and burns hotter once the flame front arrives. It depends on fuel continuity, how unbroken the carpet of burnable material is, and a drought can actually increase continuity, because it dries out the green, damp gaps and low spots that would otherwise act as natural fire breaks. Think about that carefully, because it is subtle and important. In a normal year, a landscape is not uniformly flammable. There are wet draws, shaded low spots, damp creek margins, patches of green that stay green, and these act as natural breaks, places where a spreading fire slows, stalls, or stops, because it hits fuel too wet to carry it. They are the landscape's own fire breaks, free of charge, but in a deep enough drought, those wet spots dry out too. The damp draw is no longer damp, the green margin has cured, and the fire that would have stopped at that natural break in a normal year now sails straight across it, because the break is gone. The drought does not just dry the fuel, it erases the gaps between the fuel. The rate of spread also depends on wind, and a drought does not control the wind, but it does not need to. The wind on any given day is a loaded die, and sooner or later it comes up windy, and when it does, the fire that is already burning in dried-out continuous fuel gets its engine. It depends on temperature and humidity, and droughts tend to arrive packaged with hotter air and drier air, both of which prime fuel and speed combustion, because hot dry air pulls moisture out of fine fuels even faster, and gives the fire a warmer, more receptive medium to advance through. And it depends on slope, which, in the steep hills south of Simi Valley, we have already seen working as an accelerant, the fire preheating its own uphill path. So in a drought year, a fire is not just easier to start. Once it is lit, it runs faster, jumps further on its embers, crosses the breaks that used to stop it, and reaches more ground before any crew on Earth can cut a line around it. That is precisely why the Sandy fire did its worst damage in its first 24 hours. That early window, while the wind was up and the fuel was receptive and the natural breaks were dried out, was the window in which a small ignition became something a city had to flee. The drought set the table for every single bit of it. The easy start, the fast spread, the jumped breaks, the embers ahead of the line. Here is the part that I find genuinely sobering, and it is the honest heart of this whole story. None of what I have just told you is a mystery. There is no exotic explanation here, no unknown force, no scientific puzzle waiting to be solved, no debate among experts about the mechanism. The fire triangle is old, settled, textbook science. It is taught to every wildland firefighter on their first day. Fuel moisture is measured and sampled and forecast routinely by fire weather agencies. The mechanism that turned a tractor spark into a 40,000-person evacuation is completely, boringly, unanimously understood, and that is exactly what makes it frightening. The unsettling thing is not that the science is uncertain. The unsettling thing is that the science is crystal clear, and what it clearly says is that a country sitting in a record-tier drought has quietly lost the natural margin of safety it used to have against careless, accidental, ordinary human sparks. That margin was never something we built, or paid for, or maintained, or even noticed. It was a free gift from a wetter landscape, a service the green hillsides performed for us silently, for free, every day, by simply being too wet to burn. And right now, across an enormous fraction of the United States, that gift has been withdrawn. The hillsides have stopped performing the service, and almost nobody noticed the moment it happened, because it did not happen in a moment. It happened over a long, dry, quiet winter and spring. There is something else worth saying here, about why this danger is so easy to miss until it is on top of you. Drought is the slowest disaster there is, and slowness is a kind of camouflage. An earthquake announces itself in seconds, a flood arrives in hours, a hurricane is tracked and named and forecast days out, and you can watch it coming on a map. But a drought has no single moment. There is no day the alarm goes off. The hillside that is dangerous in May looked, in March, like a hillside. It looked, in April, like a slightly drier hillside. The fuel moisture fell a little each week. The green faded a shade at a time. The snowpack that should have fed the soil never arrived. And none of it was visible as an event, because none of it was an event. It was an absence. Drought is a disaster made entirely of things that did not happen. The rain that did not fall, the snow that did not pile up, the runoff that never came. And human attention is very, very bad at noticing absences. We notice the flood. We do not notice the slow, months-long drying that built the conditions for the fire. By the time the fire makes the drought visible, the drought has already done all of its work. The Sandy Fire is in part a drought becoming briefly visible, the slow disaster finally producing a fast one, so that for a few days we could actually see it. I want to add one more layer to the fire triangle picture, because there is a subtlety that makes the drought even more dangerous than the simple version suggests. We've been talking about fuel moisture as though every plant on a hillside dries at the same rate, but they do not. Different fuels respond to dryness on different timescales. The thinnest, finest fuels, cured grass, dead leaves, small twigs, react to the dryness of the air almost immediately, within hours. They are the first to become dangerous, and they are what carries a fire fast across the ground. Heavier fuels, thick brush stems, larger dead branches, the deeper organic layers, take much longer to dry out, weeks or months of sustained drought, but once they do dry, they hold and intensify a fire rather than just spreading it. And here is why a prolonged record-tier drought is so much worse than a short dry spell. A short dry spell only cures the fine fuels. The fire it produces moves fast but stays relatively shallow, and a change in the weather can knock it down. A long drought cures everything, the fine fuels and the heavy fuels together. Now the fine fuels carry the fire quickly, and the heavy fuels, also dried out, give it depth and staying power and resistance to being put out. A months-long drought does not just light the surface of the landscape, it dries the landscape all the way through. And that is the state Southern California's fuels were in when the tractor struck the rock. Not a quick surface dryness, but a deep, structural dryness that had been building since the start of the year. The fire that resulted had both qualities at once, the speed of cured fine fuel and the stubbornness of cured heavy fuel. Which raises the obvious next question. How big is the drought, really? How dry are we actually talking about? Because if the drought is the true cause of the Sandy Fire, then the size and the reach of that drought is the size and the reach of the danger. If the drought is small and local, then the Sandy Fire is a local warning. If the drought is enormous, then the Sandy Fire is a warning to everyone, and the answer is going to take us far, far beyond the hills of Ventura County. Part 4. The driest the country has been in living memory. To understand the Sandy Fire, you have to understand the ground it started on. And to understand that ground, you have to understand what kind of year, climatologically, the United States has been having. Because the hills south of Simi Valley did not get this dry by accident, and they did not get this dry alone, and they did not get this dry quickly. We have talked about this drought before on this channel, and I want to bring you up to speed without getting lost in it. Because the drought is not today's story, the Sandy Fire is. But the drought is the reason the Sandy Fire could happen, so we cannot skip it, and I do not want to skip it. Because the scale of it is genuinely difficult to absorb. In our video from earlier this month on the worst drought in the modern instrumental record, we laid out the scale of what the country is living through, and the scale is historic in the most literal sense of that word. The opening months of 2026 were, by the measurements, the driest start to a year the United States has recorded in well over a century of continuous careful record-keeping, a record that reaches back across roughly 131 years. I want you to really hear what that means, because the word record gets worn smooth from overuse and stops landing. 131 years of measurements. More than a century and a quarter of people, in thousands of places across this country, carefully writing down how much rain and snow fell. Across that entire span, across every dry year anyone in the historical record ever lived through, every drought their grandparents told stories about, the start of 2026 was the driest, not one of the driest, the driest. We are not talking about a dry spring. We are not talking about an unusually rain-light April. We are talking about the driest such stretch in the entire reliable instrumental history of the country. And it is not confined to one corner of the map. At the point we covered it, drought conditions of one severity or another stretched across more than 40% of the contiguous United States. More than 40%. Take a map of the lower 48 states and shade in nearly half of it, and you have a rough picture of how much of this country is currently running a moisture deficit. The drought is not a regional problem that the rest of us can watch from a safe distance, the way someone in Maine might watch a fire in California as essentially foreign news. It is a near-continental condition. It reaches into places that do not think of themselves as fire country at all. Now bring that fact into contact with the fire triangle we just built. We said the drought removes the fuel limitation, that it switches off the landscape's natural fireproofing by draining the water out of the vegetation. If that is true in one place, it is a local fire risk, a problem for that place. If it is true across 40% of the country, then the thing that happened in Ventura County is not a Ventura County problem. It is a property of a huge slice of the American map. The Sandy Fire is just the place where the condition happened to express itself first, and loudly this week. The condition itself, the dried-out, preloaded fuel bed, is sitting there, quiet and invisible, under a near-continental stretch of ground. Let us narrow back down to Southern California specifically, because the regional picture there is where the Sandy Fire actually lives, and the fire behaviour forecasters who study this for a living have been remarkably direct about it. These are not alarmists. These are operational scientists whose job is to be calibrated and accurate, because crews and lives depend on their assessments. And their assessment of Southern California right now is sober and pointed. It comes down to a few linked observations. There is an unusually heavy load of grass, what they call high grass fuel loads. There was enough moisture earlier in the season to grow a thick crop of grass, and then the moisture shut off, and now all that grass is curing, drying out, turning from green living fuel into dead fine fuel, the carpet of kindling we talked about. This is one of the cruel tricks of how drought and fire interact. A wet spell early on does not protect you. It can do the opposite. It grows a heavy crop of grass, and then if the moisture stops, that heavy crop simply cures into a heavy fuel load. The grass that looked lush in the early spring becomes the fuel bed in the late spring. On top of that, forecasters point to the weakening of the marine layer, the bank of cool, moist ocean air that normally pushes inland off the Pacific and keeps coastal Southern California's vegetation damp well into the early summer. That marine moisture is a big part of why coastal California is not normally a May fire ground. The cool damp air off the ocean is a natural break on early season fire. And this year, forecasters note, that coastal moisture is weakening earlier than it should. The break is failing early. Stack those together, heavy cured grass, persistent underlying drought, and a marine layer losing its grip. And forecasters say plainly that the risk of large fires has risen across multiple fuel types, not just grass, brush, and timber, the whole spectrum of what burns, all of it edging toward readiness at once. There is one more piece, and it is the quiet one, the one that does not make headlines but explains a great deal. Forecasters point to the lack of moisture from snowmelt and spring runoff. In a normal year, the snow that piled up in the mountains over winter melts through the spring and feeds water down into the soil and the vegetation, keeping things green and damp through the start of the warm season. It is a slow-release moisture system, a kind of natural irrigation reservoir that the landscape builds up over winter and then draws on through spring, and it buys time. It keeps fuel moisture up through the months when the rain has stopped, but the heat has not fully arrived. This year, with the drought having starved the winter of precipitation, that slow-release system has much less to release. The reservoir was never filled. The snowmelt buffer is thin, and so the grasses and the fine fuels are drying out faster and earlier than they would in a year when the mountains had the water to give. The landscape's savings account is empty, and so it is running dry weeks ahead of schedule. Do you see how all of these threads tie back to the same knot? Every one of these regional details of the cured grass, the weak marine layer, the missing snowmelt, is just a different local face of the same underlying fact. The fuel in Southern California has had its water taken away through several mechanisms at once, all of them stemming from the same drought. And a fire scientist looks at that and does not see a list of separate problems. They see a fuel bed that has been loaded. They see a building filling with vapor. They see the conditions sitting there in place, fully assembled, waiting for any switch at all. On May 18th, a tractor was the switch. And here is where the drought stops being background and becomes a forecast, a warning about what is still ahead. Because the same forecasters who describe the current fuel state also describe where it is heading, and where it is heading is not better. The seasonal outlook for California calls for above normal temperatures and below normal precipitation through the spring. That is the precise combination, hot and dry, that accelerates the drying of fine fuels. The trend is not toward relief. The trend is toward more curing, more loading, a fuel bed that gets more receptive, not less, as the weeks go on. The building is not being aired out. The vapor is still being pumped in. It is worth pausing on one more idea before we move on, because it ties the drought directly to the speed we saw in the fire's first day. There is a useful way fire scientists think about a landscape's readiness, sometimes described in terms of how much energy is stored and available to be released. Picture the dried-out vegetation across a hillside as a kind of battery. Every cured blade of grass, every moisture-starved shrub, every dead branch on the ground is a small cell in that battery, and the drought has spent months charging it, not by adding anything, but by removing the water that kept the energy locked up and unavailable. A green, well-watered hillside is a discharged battery. The potential energy is there in the plant matter, but it cannot be released, because the water stands in the way. A drought-cured hillside is a charged battery. The chemical energy in all that dry plant matter is now available, sitting there, ready to be released the instant something completes the circuit. The ignition source, the tractor, the flare, is just the thing that completes the circuit. And once the circuit is closed, the fire is not slowly building energy. It is releasing energy that the drought already stored, all season long across every acre. That is why a drought fire does not start small and grow gradually the way our intuition expects. It can come out of the gate moving fast because it is not generating its intensity from scratch. It is cashing in months of stored drought-charged potential. The Sandy Fire's furious first 24 hours were the battery discharging. We will come back to what that means for the rest of the year because it is the note this video has to end on. But for now, hold this. The Sandy Fire did not happen in a vacuum. It happened on top of the driest start to a year in 131 years, in a region whose natural moisture defences, its marine layer, its snowmelt, its green grass, are all failing at the same time, with a forecast that says the loading will continue. The tractor's spark fell onto the most receptive fuel bed this part of the country has offered in a very long time. Of course it ran. Given everything we now know, it would have been more surprising if it had not. But I do not want you to take my word for the pattern. I do not want this to rest on a single fire and a single argument. Because if the real cause of the Sandy Fire is the drought-loaded fuel bed, if the ignition source has truly become interchangeable, then we should be able to test that idea. We should be able to look for a second fire in the same region, in the same week, started by a completely different and completely unrelated accidental cause, and see whether it tells the same story. If the fuel state argument is right, That second fire should behave the same way despite a totally different spark, and as it happens, there is exactly such a fire. It was burning at the very same time just offshore in plain sight, and it is the cleanest piece of corroborating evidence you could ask for. Part 5. A second fire, a second accident, the same lesson. While crews fought the Sandy fire in the hills above Simi Valley, a much larger fire was burning out on the water, on Santa Rosa Island, one of the islands of Channel Islands National Park, roughly 50 miles off the Southern California coast. I want to tell you how that one started, because the cause is so different from a tractor hitting a rock, and yet the story it tells is exactly, eerily the same. And I want to tell it carefully because it is, in its own way, a small human drama with a strange and uncomfortable ending. A 67-year-old man was sailing. His boat, his sailboat, crashed onto the rocks off Santa Rosa Island and was wrecked. Picture his situation. He was stranded alone on an island, with a destroyed vessel and no easy way to call for help. This is, by any measure, an emergency, the kind of genuine peril that the entire apparatus of maritime safety exists to address. So he did the thing that a stranded mariner is supposed to do, the responsible thing, the thing the flares in a boat's emergency kit exist for, the thing every piece of safety guidance would tell him to do. He set off distress flares to signal SOS, to throw a bright burning point of light into the sky, to try to draw the attention of any aircraft or vessel that might be passing, so that someone would know he was there and come for him. Someone did. The US Coast Guard rescued him the next morning, after he spent a night stranded on the island. As a survival story, it ends well. The man did the right thing, and the system worked, and he lived. If the story stopped there, it would be a small good story about emergency preparedness functioning the way it is supposed to. But according to the Coast Guard, those distress flares, the flares fired in a genuine, justified, textbook-correct call for rescue, are the suspected source of the fire. A flare is, by design, a burning object. It is a controlled point of intense heat and light, and it has to come down somewhere. These came down into the island's dry vegetation, and the fire that resulted did not stay small. By May 19th, that fire on Santa Rosa Island had burned around 16,600 acres. Let that land, and compare it to what we have been discussing. 16,600 acres, roughly 23 square miles, which is something like 10 times the size of the Sandy fire. It had swept across much of the southeastern quadrant of the island. It destroyed at least one cabin and an equipment shed, and at least 2 historic structures on the island were lost. It forced the evacuation of 11 National Park Service employees, and the island, a place people go to camp and hike, a habitat for island foxes and spotted skunks and elephant seals, a protected piece of the national park system, was closed to the public. There was no containment reported in the early updates. The fire burned through grassland, coastal sage scrub and island chaparral, the same families of fuel, broadly, that cover so much of coastal Southern California. Now hold the 2 fires side by side and look very carefully at what they have in common and what they do not. This comparison is the experiment, and I want to walk through it like an experiment. What they do not have in common is the cause. One was a tractor striking a rock on agricultural land in the hills of a mainland suburb. The other was a shipwrecked sailor firing emergency flares on a remote island 50 miles out to sea. These are not related events. There is no connection between them. They involve different people, different places, different machines, different intentions, different circumstances entirely. One was a piece of routine agricultural work on a Monday morning. The other was a desperate act of survival by a man stranded after a shipwreck. If you sat down and tried, deliberately, to design 2 ignition events with nothing whatsoever in common, different geography, different cause, different human story, different machine, different intent, you could hardly do better than these 2. They are about as unrelated as 2 wildfire ignitions in the same week and region could possibly be, and yet, look at what they share. Both ignition sources were mundane in their energy. Neither was a powerful, dramatic, catastrophe-grade event, a spark off a rock, a handheld signal flare. In the grand accounting of how much raw energy it takes to do something, both of these are tiny. Both were, in any reasonable sense, accidents. Nobody set out to start a wildfire. One was an unlucky moment of contact. The other was an unintended consequence of a justified rescue signal. And both despite the smallness and the harmlessness of the spark, grew into major incidents in the same week, in the same region, in the same drought. This is the test I promised you, and this is the result. Think about what it would mean if the ignition source were the real cause of these fires. If that were true, then two completely unrelated, completely different ignition sources with nothing in common should not produce the same kind of outcome. Different causes should produce different effects. That is what it means for something to be a cause. But here, the two radically different causes produce the same effect: a major fire. The tractor and the flare arrived at the same destination by completely different roads, and when two completely different inputs produce the same output, basic logic tells you that the thing determining the output is not the input. It is something else, something the two cases share. So what do the two fires share? Strip away everything that is different about them, and what is left? One thing. They share the landscape, they share the fuel. Both sparks, however different, fell onto a drought-loaded fuel bed. Both landscapes were primed, both were buildings full of vapor, and so both sparks ran. Change the spark all you want. Change it from steel on stone to a marine distress flare. Change the location from a mainland hillside to an offshore island, and you get the same result, because the spark was never the variable that mattered. The loaded fuel bed was the variable that mattered. The experiment ran twice, with the ignition deliberately varied, and the fuel state held constant, and it returned the same answer both times. And consider one more detail that the two fires share, because it quietly reinforces everything. Both fires burned through the same broad families of vegetation: the grasses, the coastal sage scrub, the chaparral that cover so much of this part of California, on the mainland hills and on the offshore islands alike. These are fuels that, in a normal year, hold enough moisture through the spring to be difficult to ignite and slow to carry flame. They're not exotic, unusually flammable plants. They are the ordinary vegetation of the region. And in 2026, that ordinary vegetation, drought-cured on both the mainland and the island, behaved like an accelerant in both places. The fuel did not need to be special. It only needed to be dry. That is the quiet, repeated message of the two fires read together. It is not about unusual vegetation or unusual ignitions or unusual luck. It is about ordinary vegetation, drained of its water by an extraordinary drought, and then meeting the ordinary sparks that a populated landscape always produces. This is what scientists mean, in a quieter and more technical way, when they talk about a region's fire risk. They're not really making a prediction about ignitions. Ignitions are, in a sense, a given. In a populated and active landscape, there will always be sparks. Tractors will always, occasionally hit rocks. Boats will always occasionally wreck, and stranded sailors will always, and rightly and correctly fire their flares. Power lines will sag in the wind. Vehicles will run hot. People will always do the ordinary, necessary, and occasionally careless things that people do, because that is what it is to be a populated landscape. Those sparks are a constant. They are background noise. What is not constant, what changes year to year, season to season, drought to no drought, is whether the landscape converts those inevitable sparks into disasters. That conversion rate is the actual thing that fire risk assessment is about. And in the spring of 2026 in Southern California, the conversion rate is high. Dangerously, historically high. The background noise of ordinary sparks has not changed. What has changed is that the landscape now amplifies that noise into catastrophe. And I want to draw out one more thing from the Santa Rosa Island fire, because it sharpens the point in a way the Sandy fire alone cannot. The Santa Rosa Island fire was started by an act that nobody could possibly criticize. Firing a distress flare when you are shipwrecked and stranded is not just permitted, it is correct. It is what the safety system is designed for. The flare did exactly its job. It was a burning, highly visible signal that helped bring rescue. The man lived because of those flares, and the very same flares, doing the very same correct thing, also started a 16,000-acre fire. Not because the man did anything wrong, but because the island he was stranded on had been drought-cured into a fuel bed that could not absorb a burning object. Sit with that. We have arrived at a place where doing the textbook correct emergency action can also, through no fault of anyone, ignite a major wildfire, because the drought has made the landscape that unforgiving. That is not a story about human carelessness at all. You cannot scold it away. You cannot prevent it by telling people to be more careful, because the man was not careless. He was, if anything, exemplary. The Santa Rosa Island fire proves that the danger has moved past the reach of personal carefulness. When even the correct action can light the landscape, the problem is unambiguously the landscape. 2 fires, 2 accidents that had nothing to do with each other, one landscape telling both of them the same thing. Yes, burn. And once you see it that way, once you understand that the fuel bed is the cause and the spark is just the trigger, and that the experiment has now run twice and returned the same answer, a question rises up that is genuinely uncomfortable, and we have to face it head on, because a lot of people online are already asking a darker version of it. If 2 such convenient little accidents can produce 2 such big fires in 1 week, some are asking, is that really an accident at all? 2 harmless causes, 2 disasters perfectly timed. Isn't that too neat? Isn't that suspicious? Isn't somebody somewhere doing this on purpose? It is a fair question to have. The pattern does feel strange if you have not walked through the fuel state logic and the people asking it are not foolish. The unease underneath it is real and it is reasonable, so it deserves a real answer, not a smirk and a dismissal. Let us give it one. Part 6. How convenient, and why the truth is worse. If you spent any time online in the days after the Sandy Fire started, you saw the theory. It is worth stating it fairly, in its strongest and most sympathetic form, because the people raising it are not foolish, and because the unease behind it is something this video takes seriously. The theory goes something like this. We are asked to believe that 2 large fires erupted in Southern California in the same week, from 2 almost comically harmless causes, a tractor bumping a rock and a shipwrecked sailor's signal flare. And to some people, that does not feel like an explanation. It feels like a cover story. It feels too soft, too tidy, too convenient. The phrase that went around attached to these events was exactly that. How convenient. 2 innocent little accidents, 2 big fires, perfectly timed. And the framing suggests that the official, accidental explanations are too neat to be true, and that something is being hidden behind them, that the harmless-sounding causes are a story told to the public to obscure something deliberate. A related claim that circulated alongside it held that the official figure of 17,000 evacuees was itself a deliberate undercount, that the real number was always far higher, 50,000 or more, and that the lower number was put out on purpose to manage public perception and keep people calm. I want to take both of those seriously, because this channel does not just wave away what people are thinking. We test claims against the data. We treat the viewer as someone capable of following an argument to its end. And when you actually test these 2 claims, something genuinely interesting happens. Both of them fall apart, but the truth they fall apart into is, in a real and important sense, more alarming than the conspiracy ever was. So let us walk through it carefully, claim by claim. Start with, how convenient. The suspicion rests on an intuition about probability. The gut sense that 2 accidental wildfires in 1 week is just too unlikely to be a coincidence, so it must have been coordinated. It feels like rolling 2 dice and getting 2 sixes. It feels like the kind of result that demands an explanation beyond chance. But that intuition has the probability exactly backwards, and I want to show you why, step by step. Accidental human ignitions are not rare events. This is the single fact that the whole conspiracy framing depends on not knowing. Accidental human-caused ignitions are, by a very wide margin, the single most common way wildfires start in the United States. Year in and year out, across the country, the large majority of wildfires are sparked not by lightning, not by anything natural at all, but by people, by equipment, by vehicles, by power lines, by recreation, by debris burning, by 1,000 small, careless, or simply unlucky moments. Human-caused accidental ignition is not the strange case that needs explaining. It is the baseline. It is the normal. It is overwhelmingly what the fire data shows every single year, in ordinary years and bad ones alike. So in any given week in a populated and active landscape like Southern California, there are not 2 potential accidental ignitions. There are many. There are dozens, scores of small sparks, equipment running hot, exhaust systems over dry grass, flares, power tools, dragging chains, hot breaks, downed lines, 100 sources, happening continuously across the region. And most weeks, in a normal year, most of those sparks land, scorch a little ground, and die exactly as we described back in the fire triangle. They never become fires with names. They never make the news. They are invisible because nothing came of them. The landscape absorbed them. Now introduce the drought, and here is the crucial point. The drought, as we have established at length, does not change how many sparks there are. The number of accidental ignitions is set by how many people and machines and activities are out there, and that is roughly constant. What the drought changes is the conversion rate, the fraction of those inevitable sparks that catch and run instead of landing and fizzling. In a wet year, that conversion rate is very low. The green landscape absorbs almost every spark, and almost nothing becomes a real fire. In a record drought year, that rate climbs steeply, because the fuel state logic we built means more and more of those routine sparks now find receptive fuel. Suddenly a meaningful fraction of the background ignitions catch. And here is the key move, the move that dissolves the conspiracy. If you take the normal, large, ever-present background number of accidental sparks, and you multiply it by a drought-elevated conversion rate, what do you get? You get exactly what was observed. You get multiple accidental ignitions becoming multiple real fires, clustered together in time. The clustering is not the fingerprint of a conspiracy. The clustering is the statistically predictable signature of a prime landscape doing precisely what a prime landscape does, converting ordinary, inevitable accidents into disasters at an elevated rate. 2 fires in a week from 2 unrelated accidents is not the shocking, coordination-demanding outcome that the how convenient framing imagines. In a drought this severe, it is close to the expected outcome. It is what the math predicts. If anything, the surprising thing in a drought this deep would be a week with no significant fires at all. The convenient accidents are not suspicious. They are the data behaving exactly as the science says it should. The pattern that feels like evidence of a hidden hand is actually evidence of the drought, which is hiding from no one. Now the evacuation number, the undercount claim. And this one I have some genuine sympathy for, because the numbers really did change, and when official numbers change, people are right to notice and right to ask why. That instinct, to notice when the story shifts, is a healthy one. It just needs the right answer. Here is what actually happened. The figure of more than 17,000 people under evacuation orders was accurate when it was first reported. It was a true, honest snapshot of the situation at that specific moment. And then the fire kept growing. The wind kept shifting. The threatened area widened as the fire advanced and as forecasters projected where it might go next. And as that threatened area widened, officials did exactly what they are supposed to do, exactly what you would want them to do. They expanded the evacuation orders to cover the newly threatened neighborhoods, ahead of the fire, to get people out before the danger reached them. The number climbed, past 20,000, past 30,000, up into the range of 43,700 people under mandatory orders, with several hundred more under warnings. That is not a cover-up. That is what a developing emergency looks like in real time. Evacuation orders are not a single decision, made once and then frozen in place. They are a living, constantly updated map of risk. Orders get issued, expanded, contracted, and eventually lifted continuously, hour by hour, as the fire's behavior changes and as the wind shifts and as crews gain or lose ground. A headline number is a photograph of a moving thing, and a photograph of a moving thing is out of date the instant it is taken, not because the photographer lied, but because the thing moved. The 17,000 figure was not a lie that got exposed. It was an accurate early photograph of a situation that then changed. The lesson buried inside the undercount claim is actually a genuinely useful one, and I want to hand it to you straight because it could matter to you someday. During a fast-moving fire, do not rely on a number in a headline that might be hours old. Headlines lag. They are written, edited, published, and then they sit there, frozen, while the real situation keeps moving. If a fire is anywhere near you, go to the source. Check your county's official emergency channels directly, the Emergency Management Agency, the fire department's own updates, because those are updated continuously, and they are the actual living map. The headline number is not lying to you, but it is, by its very nature, always a little behind, and in an emergency, a little behind can be the difference that matters. I want to spend one more moment on why the conspiracy framing is not just wrong, but actively harmful, because this is not only an argument about logic, it has a real cost. When you tell people that the fires are being set deliberately by some hidden hand, You are pointing their fear, their attention, and their energy at a target that does not exist. And every unit of attention spent looking for a secret arsonist is a unit of attention not spent on the thing that is actually true and actually actionable. The landscape around you is dry, the margin is thin, and ordinary sparks are now dangerous. The conspiracy story is not just incorrect, it is a distraction from a real and learnable lesson. The person who believes the fires are a plot does not change how they handle a hot piece of equipment near dry grass, because in their model, the danger is external and orchestrated, nothing to do with them. The person who understands the fuel state reality does change their behaviour. They think twice about the lawnmower on the dry hillside, the trailer chain dragging on the highway shoulder, the equipment running hot on a windy afternoon, because they understand that in a drought, they themselves are a potential ignition, and so is everyone around them. The true story is the one that actually empowers a person to reduce risk. The conspiracy story takes that power away and replaces it with a search for a villain who is not there. That is why this channel insists on walking through the data instead of just dismissing the theory. The truth is not only more accurate, it is more useful. So both claims dissolve under the data. The "how convenient" framing dissolves because clustered accidental fires are the predicted behaviour of a drought-loaded landscape, not the fingerprint of coordination. The undercount claim dissolves because a changing evacuation number is the signature of a responsibly managed fast-developing emergency, not of a cover-up. But notice, and this is the part I most want you to sit with, because it is the real reason this section exists, notice what they dissolve into. They do not dissolve into "everything is fine, nothing to see here, go back to sleep." They dissolve into something heavier than the conspiracy they replaced. The conspiracy version of this story says, a hidden hand is starting these fires. The danger is being manufactured by someone for some purpose. And as frightening as that sounds on its surface, it contains a strange and secret comfort. If the fires are being deliberately set, then there is an enemy, there is an intention, there is a someone, and a someone can in principle be found, named, stopped, arrested, defeated. The threat is bounded, it has an edge, it has a villain, and villains can be beaten. A conspiracy is, in a backwards way, a reassuring shape for a fear to take, because it implies the fear can be resolved by catching the right person. The true version is worse, precisely because it is unbounded, and precisely because there is no one to catch. The true version says, nobody is starting these fires on purpose. They are starting from the ordinary, irreducible background hum of human accident. The tractors and the flares, and the 1,000 harmless sparks of normal life that can never be eliminated, because they are simply what it is for people to live and work on the land. And those ordinary sparks are running and becoming disasters, because the land itself has been changed underneath us. There is no hidden hand, there is no villain, there is just a drought, sitting in plain and total sight, openly documented by NOAA and by every fire weather agency in the country, reported in every climate summary, visible on every drought map, that has quietly stripped away the safety margin we all unconsciously relied on without ever knowing it was there. There is no enemy to catch, because there is no enemy. There is just a condition spread across more than 40% of the country, that takes our own ordinary, unavoidable carelessness and turns it against us. That is the more frightening story. Not because it is hidden. It is the precise opposite of hidden. It is published and mapped and free for anyone to read. But because it cannot be solved by catching anyone. You cannot arrest a drought. You cannot defeat a fuel-moisture deficit. There is no press conference where an official announces that the threat has been neutralized, because the threat is not an actor and cannot be neutralized. It can only recede slowly on its own terms when the rain and the snow eventually return in enough quantity to put the water back into the land. Until then, the condition simply persists, quietly, under the map, indifferent to the news cycle and to our attention. The people who feel that something is deeply wrong are not wrong to feel it. The country really has become more flammable. That part of their intuition is sound and correct. They have just been handed the wrong explanation for a real observation. The right explanation is documented, measurable, and, this is the hard part, not going anywhere when the news cycle moves on next week. The conspiracy would end when the villain was caught. The drought ends when the drought ends, and not one day before. I want to add one careful, honest note here, because intellectual honesty demands it. To say there is no villain in the Sandy Fire is not to say there is nothing behind the drought itself. The drought has its own causes, and the long-term drying trend across much of the American West is a serious subject that careful scientists study and, in places, connect to a warming climate. That is a real conversation, and it is a documented one. But it is not this video's conversation, and I am not going to pretend the Sandy Fire settles it. What I am saying is narrower and I think harder to argue with. Whatever the deeper causes of the drought is here, it is measured, it is mapped, and it is the proximate immediate reason a tractor spark became a 40,000-person evacuation. You do not need to agree about the ultimate cause of the dryness to see clearly what the dryness is doing. The fuel state logic holds regardless. The hillside does not care why it is dry, it only knows that it is. And that is exactly what makes the Sandy Fire a warning rather than just an incident. A villain is a story that closes, a condition is a warning that stays open. So let us talk, finally and directly, about the warning, about what this fire is actually trying to tell the rest of the country. Part 7. The warning the whole country needs to hear. Let us step back now, all the way back, and look at the Sandy Fire from the greatest possible distance, because the title of this video makes a specific claim that this fire sends a warning the whole country needs to hear, and I owe you the full argument for why a sub-2,000-acre fire in one California county deserves the attention of the entire nation. The Sandy Fire can be read on 3 levels, and I want to climb through all 3 with you, deliberately, one at a time, because the climb itself is the whole point. Each level contains the one below it, and means more than the one below it. The first level is the literal one. On this level, the Sandy Fire is a serious local emergency, and nothing more. A wildfire in the hills near Simi Valley. A tense, frightening 48 hours for the people who live there. More than 40,000 people displaced from their homes, made to gather what they could and drive away from a glowing horizon. At least one house gone, and behind that flat phrase, one home destroyed, is a family whose entire material life, whose photographs and furniture and the small irreplaceable things are now ash. A hard, dangerous fight up steep and unforgiving terrain by hundreds of crew. And then, by the May 20th update, the genuine and welcome beginning of progress, as containment climbed from 5% toward 15%, and the winds eased, and the fight began, slowly, to bend toward control. On this level, read entirely on its own, sealed off from any larger context, the Sandy Fire is a difficult but ultimately ordinary California fire story. The kind this state has, tragically, learned to absorb and move past. If this were all the Sandy Fire was, it would not be a warning to anyone outside Ventura County. It would simply be the news, and it would be forgotten in a week. The second level is the one we have spent this entire video patiently building. On this level, the Sandy Fire is not just an event, it is a demonstration. It is a clean, almost laboratory-grade demonstration of what a record drought does to the fundamental relationship between cause and consequence. We watched, step by step, the fuel limitation get removed. We built the fire triangle and watched the drought break one of its 3 legs, the leg that used to do all the protective work. We watched the ignition source shrink before our eyes to near total irrelevance. A tractor, a flare, steel on stone, a distress signal. The specifics did not matter, because the experiment ran twice with the spark deliberately varied and returned the same answer both times. We watched a spark that should have died, that in any normal year would have died, run instead, and run fast and run far, because the drought had drained the water out of everything it touched and erased the natural breaks that would have stopped it. On this second level, the Sandy Fire is a readable signal. It is the fuel bed of a large part of America, briefly and visibly lighting up, so that for a few days we could all see plainly what state that fuel bed is in. And the state it is in is one word: ready. And then there is the third level, and this is the one the title is truly about, and the one the whole country, not just California, not just the fire-prone West, the whole country, needs to hear. The drought is not a Simi Valley problem, it is not even a California problem. We said it back in part 4, and now its full weight should finally land with everything behind it. This drought covers more than 40% of the contiguous United States, and the entire chain of logic we have built today, The long chain that took a tractor's small spark and followed it, link by link, all the way to a 40,000-person evacuation. That chain is not made of anything local. Look back at every link in it. The fire triangle is universal physics. Fuel moisture is universal. Every plant everywhere holds water and loses it under drought. The principle that a drought removes the fuel limitation and collapses the ignition threshold and makes the spark interchangeable. That principle does not care, even slightly, whether it is operating in the brushy hills of Ventura County, or the cured grasslands of the Great Plains, or the dried-out scrub of the interior West, or the moisture-starved forests and fields of the Southeast. The logic is portable. It travels. Wherever the land is drought-dry, that same chain of cause and effect is assembled and armed, just waiting, as it waited in Simi Valley for a switch. So the Sandy Fire is, in the most precise sense I can give you, a preview. It is a small, early, contained, survivable sample of a failure mode that is currently latent, present but not yet triggered, across an enormous fraction of the American map. More than 40,000 people in Ventura County got to experience this week, in a contained and survivable form, what it looks and feels like when a drought-loaded landscape converts an ordinary, blameless human accident into a disaster that uproots a city. And the deeply uncomfortable truth, the truth this video has been walking toward from its first sentence, is that the conditions which made that possible in their particular hills are not unique to their hills. Those conditions exist right now, today, under a near-continental stretch of this country, in places that have never thought of themselves as fire country and have no cultural memory of it. And I want to dwell on that last point because it is the part most likely to be underestimated. There is a tendency, especially outside the West, to think of wildfire as a regional specialty, a California thing, an Arizona thing, something that happens to other people in other landscapes. That mental map is comforting and it is wrong. Fire is not a property of a region. It is a property of a fuel bed and a set of conditions, and fuel beds exist everywhere there is vegetation. Grass is fuel, brush is fuel, forest is fuel, croplands, pastures, roadside vegetation, the dry margins of suburbs. All of it is fuel, and all of it obeys the exact same fire triangle and the exact same fuel-moisture rules we built earlier in this video. The only reason a given place is not thought of as fire country is that historically its fuel has usually been wet enough to refuse ignition. That is not a permanent trait of the place. It is a description of its usual moisture. Take that moisture away, and a record drought across 40% of the country is, by definition, taking that moisture away across 40% of the country, and the place that was not fire country becomes, quietly, fire country. It does not need a new climate or a new ecosystem. It just needs to be dry. And large parts of this country that have never built a culture of fire awareness, never developed the instincts, never thought of their own grass and brush as dangerous, are right now, this season, dry. They are holding a loaded fuel bed and in many cases do not know it, because nothing has come along yet to make it visible. The Sandy Fire made it visible in Ventura County. The same condition is sitting invisible in a great many counties that have not had their Sandy Fire yet. That is the warning. The warning is not beware of tractors. It would be a far smaller and far more manageable world if the lesson were about one specific machine, because then you could simply be careful with that machine. The warning is much larger and much harder than that. The warning is this: the margin for error has collapsed. The invisible buffer that used to sit between an ordinary careless human moment and a full-scale catastrophe, the buffer that was made of nothing at all except the natural moisture held in a healthy living landscape, that buffer has thinned to almost nothing across an enormous part of the United States. And until the drought genuinely fully breaks, the cost of ordinary human carelessness, and even the cost of ordinary human non-carelessness, of justified acts like firing a rescue flare, has been quietly, invisibly, uniformly multiplied everywhere the land is dry. I think the deepest thing the Sandy Fire took from those 40,000 people was not, in the end, a number of acres, or even the one lost home, terrible as that is. I think the deepest thing it took was an assumption. All of us walk around every day carrying a quiet, unexamined, never-spoken belief that small accidents stay small, that a spark is just a spark, that a bumped rock is nothing, that if you are not doing anything reckless, not doing anything dramatic or stupid, then the ordinary frictions of an ordinary life, the tools and the engines and the chores and the drives and the routine maintenance of simply existing in a place, are fundamentally basically safe. That belief is so deep that we do not even experience it as a belief. We just live inside it, the way you live inside the air, without noticing it is there. The Sandy Fire is a quiet, almost gentle demonstration that this belief is no longer reliable. Look hard at the two people at the centre of these two fires. A man was operating a tractor on his own land, doing necessary work. A sailor, shipwrecked and in genuine danger, fired the distress flares that the law and good sense and every safety manual told him to fire. Neither of them did anything reckless. Neither of them did anything wrong. I want to be completely clear about that, because it is the whole point. There is no carelessness to scold here, no villain, not even really a mistake. And the landscape took those two entirely ordinary, entirely defensible, entirely human moments and turned them into evacuations and lost homes and a closed national park. The assumption that small accidents stay small was, this week, in Southern California, simply and demonstrably false. It used to be true. The drought made it false. And that brings us to the last and hardest part of all of this. Because a warning, no matter how clear, no matter how well evidenced, only does its job if someone actually hears it. And the Sandy Fire, for all that it has to tell us, told us in a very quiet voice. Part 8. A warning delivered quietly. Here is the difficult thing about the Sandy Fire, the thing I have been circling through this entire video, and the note I want to leave you sitting with when it ends. This was a warning delivered quietly, and quiet warnings are the easiest kind to ignore. Think about how this fire could have been worse, and think about how easily, how nearly it could have been worse. The winds that first day gusted past 30 miles an hour, but they did not build into a sustained firestorm-grade wind event, the kind of relentless wind that drives a fire faster than anyone can flee it. And then, crucially, overnight they fell off entirely, and that lull handed the firefighters the opening they needed. That was luck. The wind owed them nothing. The fire started in clear daylight in mid-morning, in plain view right above a populated suburb, so it was seen and reported and attacked within minutes rather than smouldering unwitnessed for hours in some roadless canyon. That was luck of timing and geography. There were roughly 869 personnel, plus aircraft, available to be thrown at it fast, because no larger catastrophe was consuming the region's firefighting capacity at that same moment. No competing megafire was holding the crews and the tankers somewhere else. That was luck too. In a worse week, those resources are committed elsewhere. The terrain was steep and cruel, but the ignition happened to land in a spot, and on a day where a hard fight could still just barely get ahead of it. By the May 20th update, containment was climbing, and the story was bending slowly toward control. One home was lost. As of the latest reporting, no lives. In the grim, hard arithmetic of California wildfire, that is, genuinely, and we should be grateful for it, a merciful outcome. But I want you to see clearly what that merciful outcome actually was. The Sandy Fire is what this failure mode looks like, when nearly everything that could possibly break in your favour does break in your favour. The favourable overnight winds, the daylight start, the available crews, the survivable patch of terrain, line them all up. This was the gentle version. This was the failure mode showing us its mildest face. This was the warning at its lowest possible volume. And the genuinely unsettling question, the one I cannot answer for you, the one I do not think anyone can answer for you, the one I want to hand to you to carry instead, is whether a country actually hears a warning delivered that quietly. Whether a fire of under 2,000 acres, one that mostly spared lives and mostly spared homes, one that resolved toward containment within a few days and gave the cameras only a few dramatic afternoons of footage, is loud enough to truly register, or whether it simply gets filed away as just another California fire, a familiar shape, a few days of orange skies on the news, a story that scrolls past, and then is quietly forgotten the moment the news cycle turns to the next thing. Its lesson left sitting on the table unread while everyone moves on. Because here is what we know, and this part is not speculation, this part is forecast, published and on the record. We know the drought is still in place. It did not end when the Sandy Fire's containment lines went in. We know the seasonal outlook for California calls for above normal heat, and below normal rain through the spring, which means, in the language of everything we have built today, more drying, more curing, more loading of the fuel bed, not less. The building is still filling with vapor, and we know what the fire behavior projections for the full 2026 California fire season actually say, in plain numbers. They call for something on the order of 500,000 to 750,000 acres burned across the state this year, across an estimated 8,000 to 9,000 individual wildfires, and they warn, explicitly and without hedging, that as the season deepens, conditions will increasingly favour fires that ignite more readily, that spread faster, that grow larger, and that resist containment harder than they do now. Read the Sandy Fire against that forecast, and its true nature finally comes into focus. The Sandy Fire is not the season. The Sandy Fire is the season clearing its throat. It is one early, contained, survivable sample arriving in the middle of May, before the traditional fire season has even properly begun, before the worst of the heat, before the autumn winds. A single data point at the leading edge of a pattern that the forecasters are telling us, in flat and unhedged language, is still building and still ahead of us. And I want to be precise about why the timing of the Sandy Fire, the fact that it happened in May, is itself part of the warning and not just a detail. The traditional, historical, dangerous window for major Southern California fire is late summer into fall. That is when the fuels are most thoroughly cured by a long dry summer, and it is when the offshore wind events, the hot, dry, downslope winds that drive the region's worst fires, are most common. May is supposed to be early. May is supposed to still have some of the spring's moisture in the system, still have the marine layer doing its work, still have green in the grass. A fire that forces 40,000 evacuations in May is a fire that is happening out of season, and out of season is exactly what you would expect to see if the drought has shifted the whole calendar of danger earlier. The fuel that should not be cured until August is cured in May. The dryness that should be a late summer condition is a late spring condition. So the Sandy Fire is not only an early sample of the season's pattern, it is evidence that the season itself has expanded, that the window of danger has stretched open wider at the front end, and if the front end has moved earlier, there is no particular reason to think the back end has moved earlier to match. The likeliest reading is not that the dangerous season has shifted, it is that the dangerous season has grown longer. The Sandy Fire is what the leading edge of a longer, hungrier fire season looks like, and there is even a final cruel mechanism waiting in the wings, one worth naming. Forecasters note that any brief vegetation growth from late-season storms, any short wet spell that greens things up for a moment, simply adds more fine fuel to the landscape, fuel that will then cure and load the system further when the dry returns. So the landscape may not merely stay loaded, it may load further, deeper, before the real peak of the season ever arrives. So the question stands, and it stands squarely in front of all of us. We have been handed a warning. It came at low volume, a tractor, a rock, a spark, a few hard and frightening days, a city that, in the end, got most of its people and most of its homes back. The mechanism behind that warning is not mysterious, not contested, not hidden. It is documented, measurable, mapped, and openly published by every weather and fire agency in the country, free for anyone to read. And what that mechanism says, clearly and without ambiguity, is this. Across more than 40% of the United States, the natural margin of safety against an ordinary spark has been stripped away. And it will stay stripped away until the drought breaks, on the drought's own schedule, and not one day sooner. There is a phrase that fire-aware communities use, and I think it belongs at the end of this video, because it captures the one practical thing a person can carry away from all of this. The phrase is, fires do not start, they are started. It sounds like a small distinction, but it is the whole lesson compressed. It means that in a landscape primed to burn, the fire is not some autonomous force of nature that descends out of nowhere. It is the predictable result of an ignition meeting a fuel bed, and the ignition, far more often than not, is us. Equipment, vehicles, tools, the ordinary friction of human life. In a wet year, that fact is almost harmless because the fuel bed forgives. In a drought year, that fact becomes the most important thing you can know because the fuel bed no longer forgives anything. And the quiet, unglamorous, genuinely useful response to that is not panic, and it is not a search for villains. It is awareness. It is understanding that when the land is dry, every one of us is carrying a potential ignition. in our cars, our tools, our equipment, our habits. And that ordinary caution, the boring kind, the kind nobody makes a video about, is the one lever an individual actually holds. The drought is not something you can fix by Friday. But the conversion of your own ordinary sparks into the next sandy fire is, at the margin, something you can affect. That is not a dramatic conclusion, but it is a true one, and it is yours to act on. A tractor hit a rock. One small, ordinary, unremarkable moment. The kind that happens unnoticed all the time, all across this country, every single day. And in doing so, it told us something true and something urgent about the entire country. The only thing left genuinely undecided, the one variable that is not written into any forecast, the one factor that depends entirely and only on us, is whether we were actually listening while the warning was still this quiet, whether a small fire in the hills above one suburb is enough, or whether we do what we have so often done before and wait, comfortably, distractedly, inside our old assumption that small accidents stay small, for the same warning to be delivered again, later this year, at full volume.